Welcome to the Greenwood. I'm your host, Thaddeus Papke, and this is the podcast where we peek under the hood of the most famous outlaw who may have never been. From archers to archaeologists, we interview subject matter experts and content creators to learn why this figure continues to endure and consider what we can learn by examining what historian Maurice Keene called the matter of the Greenwood. When you hear the name Robin Hood, there are undoubtedly images that immediately come to mind. Perhaps those images come from Hollywood films, storybooks, cartoons. There are also certain associations that you're likely to make. There's social qualities, such as having a band of merry men, and that classic notion of robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Maybe you also think of castles, knights, and archery contests. Perhaps, as discussed in some episodes earlier this year, you think of spiritual connections to ancient woodlands or forest living. But how much are the associations that we make similar to the associations that were being made about the character in the Middle Ages, when his stories were first being told? Now, there is no single author that we can point at for the origin of Robin Hood, and certainly no contemporary reviews. Or are there? We actually have reactions to the tales of Robin Hood that predate our earliest transcriptions of any of the poems, plays, or ballads, which means we know a little bit about what people were saying and thinking about Robin Hood before we actually know what those stories were. Now, to help me make sense of how people in medieval England viewed and used the figure of Robin Hood, I invited back onto the podcast Will Hoff, as he was visiting the UK to present at the International Medieval Congress at the University of Leeds and engage in some manuscript study here in the UK to discuss his latest areas of research. So, string your bow, can your rhymes of Robin Hood, and join me in the Greenwood with historian and Robin Hood scholar Will Hoff. Let's go ahead and get a little bit into the topic that brought you to the UK and your paper that you presented at Leeds.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit of a first, since you are the first special guest we've had on the podcast to make a return appearance to the podcast in something other than the form of a co-host for Splitting Arrows.
Nice.
Tell us all, though, just a little bit of where you are in your academic career, and then what brought you to Leeds this past month.
Yeah, so I am exactly halfway through my PhD research. I've 18 months down, 18 months to go, more or less. So I'm at the stage where, so being in Melbourne, at the University of Melbourne, is very hard to do any manuscript research or some rare printed book research, because there's only so much stuff that Australian universities have collected over the years. So I had to come over to do a research trip just in general, one, to try and find some useful sources, but also two, simply just to do the work of sitting in the British Library or Cambridge University Library and just going through the motions of ordering manuscripts and working through them and handling them. So it's part of just the general training of history work, is coming here and doing that sort of work, which in Australia is in a very different context. So we do have medieval manuscripts and early printed books at, like, my library at the University of Melbourne, but it's a very different process than it is here. So it's coming over and learning how to do that work, basically. But then also there's the International Medieval Congress, which is here in Leeds every year. So that's the big conference of medieval and early modern researchers across the world. So it was my first time that I was able to apply for or put in a paper proposal, knowing that I could possibly come over and apply for funding to come do that research and come to Leeds, and that all worked out really, really well. So yeah, I was over here giving a paper which is very much a hypothesis more than anything, particularly well argued, because conferences are fantastic for testing out ideas and getting feedback from people and ideas from people. So broadly speaking, my PhD is about Robin Hood in the 15th and 16th centuries as an idea.
Right.
So talking about the way that Robin Hood was negotiated and renegotiated to mean different things at different times, but with the argument that at any given time, there is an understanding that he means this. And people like that or they don't like that, but there is still an agreed thing of Robin Hood means this until he's renegotiated to mean something new. So we have lots of different texts and lots of different modes of engagement with Robin Hood, like poems and just appearances in public, like in procession, and plays and play games. So plays that have a genuine competitive aspect. So lots of different versions that you can engage with Robin Hood. And that's sort of being read as Robin Hood can be anything. He means anything to anyone. He means all things to all people. And my argument is that if you look at all of these contexts, they're aesthetically different and their form is different, but the way in which the character is being engaged is the same, and it has the same meaning and the same social function and the same political meaning. So if you look at any given year or any given decade and look at all the different Robin Hood engagements that are popping up, they are different to each other, but the way that Robin is being understood and mobilized is essentially the same in that period of time. So I'm trying to put some of the historical and political context back into the character of Robin Hood, not to argue that he existed. It's not arguing for Robin Hood as history, but sort of doing Robin Hood in history, which has been not neglected, but it's been very much a literary study for a very long time. And I think we're now at a stage where the literary scholarship is so robust, we can now go back to some of the earlier questions from the 50s and 60s that started Robin Hood scholarship that were maybe a little bit too emphatic in saying Robin Hood was a peasant hero, Robin Hood was a rebellious figure in history that the literary history was pushing back against. So we're now at a stage where we can come back and start asking those earlier questions, but in a much more informed way because of all this fantastic work that's been done the last 30 years or so.
Yeah. So one of the things that I am, really interested in and have been exploring on the podcast is this idea of how the past has informed our understanding of Robin Hood today. And we're so influenced by popular culture. And with mass media and films, those have really kind of done so much to dictate what people today in the 21st century think about Robin Hood, visually and in terms of character and in terms of story. But that's really a tradition of only 100 years, almost exactly 100 years. And those films were informed by plays and operas and works like Ivanhoe. So it's not as though it just sprang whole cloth out of the Douglas Fairbanks movie or anything like that. But I have a harder time figuring out, and this is why I'm not a historian, and that's why there is so much academic work still to do on the topic, is figuring out before mass media what were the popular concepts of Robin Hood before the child ballads, which were a form of mass media in their own way, were all being collected. How are people thinking about Robin Hood? How are they encountering him? So let's say somebody in the period that you're studying, if they're peasant who goes to these play games, how are they going to think about Robin Hood? What is Robin Hood going to look like to them? And is it different than how their lord might be thinking about the same character?
Yeah. So a very one thing I just would mention first off is just a very technical thing, because I've had, like classic reviewer 2 stuff lately in a few papers. So there's this term play games, which I use in the way that Stephen Knight, who's very prolific Robin Hood scholar, who's one of my supervisors at the moment, he uses the term play games as a way of acknowledging that plays in a sort of dramatic sense and games in a sort of competitive sense were basically interchangeably used. Those terms, play and games, are interchangeably used in the documents that are evidence for these things. And so because it's so tough to disentangle them, he just says play game. And if there's any specificity to be used, he uses it there. But I think in terms of the way that people are engaging with Robin Hood, they're engaging with it the same way. So a peasant going and seeing, or, a worker or a merchant or whatever, someone who is a lay person in the late Middle Ages going and seeing Robin Hood, they're likely to, let's just say after 1450 in England, they're going to see a Whitsun play in which someone is performing a Robin Hood play. So they're dressed up as Robin Hood. There's a cast of characters and they are having a fight that has a genuinely competitive aspect to it. So if they have a script, and there is one single surviving play game text that we know of, which we can talk about, it gives directions to have a fight, and the idea is that that fight will be real and there is a real winner, but then you continue with the narrative.
Do we know if those fights would be like with cudgels? Would they be wrestling? What kind of fight?
Yeah, so there's wrestling. So the play game text, so it's around 1475. It's just a single page that has dialogue written on it, and it's very perfunctory. It's incredibly blunt. So it's probably just intended to be read very quickly to get the general gist of what the narrative will be, for then actors to then play Robin Hood and play all the different characters and perform that. So in that text, it says I cleave the stick. So it's an archery contest shooting at a wand, and it's I throw the stone. So there's a stone throwing competition, and then there's a tossing the caber sort of competition and a wrestling competition. So they're very physical games. That is probably the reason why sword fights and quarterstaff fights and wrestling are features of the poems, like Robin Hood and the Potter comes to mind, or the sequence in The Jest of Robin Hood where Sir Richard at the Lee goes past a wrestling competition between 2 yeomen. Those aspects in the poems are probably there because Robin Hood narratives were happening with these competitive aspects to them.
Yeah, so archery contests in there too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as a layperson going to a Robin Hood performance, you'd be seeing these sorts of things, but it would be in the context of a Whitsun time period, a festival period that was taking place on your lord's land. So the owners of the land would be seeing those same performances. So James Holt had an idea, this is back in the 80s, that the Robin Hood story started out in the 13th century with sort of traveling minstrels going into courts, because if there are rhymes of Robin Hood, like what's in William Langland's poem in 1377, which is the first evidence for Robin Hood as a literary character, James Holt's idea was that, well, if these are rhymes, they're quite refined, they're quite well worked, therefore Robin Hood probably had a gentry origin, because minstrels would be the sort of people playing these things. And so minstrels would then go from lord's house to lord's house. And so his idea was that it started in gentry households and then became popular, sort of in a top-down way.
And he is mentioned in the same breath as a lord, Randolph, Earl of Chester.
Yeah. Except that I'm not sure that's quite how it works, because if you look at the record of just the name Robin Hood, it's very low-hanging fruit. It's all criminals. It's all regular guys just off in random parishes paying their taxes in the late 13th century. So it seems to be actually bottom up in terms of having some sort of developed tradition over time, which then raises to the standard of then being performed at these annual festivals that by their nature take place on a lord's land. So the question is more the extent to which they were tolerated. So it's really tough talking about class in the Middle Ages when it comes to entertainment, because the entertainment was central and everyone attended them. So there wasn't necessarily, in these sort of very public summer entertainments, there isn't an enormous distinction between a elite version of it, or things that were just for elite participation and things that were just for lay participation, because it was so public. But there is a question of, as it is on the Lord's land, what do they let in? And so I guess in that sense, that sort of leads people to think that because a lord is allowing Robin Hood on his land, Robin can't have been that subversive because he was being effectively endorsed by being on a lord's land. Except that's just a bit too simplistic, I think, because we need to take into account if something is popular, you want to let people do it to then become popular yourself. So there's lots of complicated questions where once you start to pick at something, it then unravels something else and you have to address that. So that's what makes me think when people say, oh, Robin Hood was everything. That's just a bit of a cheap way of not having to address all of these very conflicting ideas about Robin Hood. And that's quite tough to disentangle them. But I think it's worth doing that disentangling, because the result, if we don't, is just this idea of, oh, Robin Hood was just around and then he was in plays later on. And if we take that approach to Robin Hood of understanding him as just a character that was around and people liked him and other people didn't, then we don't actually know anything about Robin Hood that we didn't know already.
Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about what you were just saying about him being like what would be allowed in these, Whitsun presentations on the Lord's land. And I'm thinking about those earliest stories that we have, and who are the ones that are the villains, who are the ones that are kind of getting made fun of. And it's not lords. The king comes off pretty well in those. The closest there is to a lord that gets his comeuppance is the Sheriff of Nottingham, but he's very specifically put forward there as an unlikable lawman and tax collector. And I know sheriffs often could be very unpopular at times. And then also members of the church. You have a lot of churchmen who are the bad guys. But the king comes off well. Sir Richard of the Lee comes off well. The actual, the nobles, the lords, are actually presented in kind of a heroic role.
Yeah, for sure. I think the fun thing with Robin Hood is that it sort of forces you to have an opinion regardless. So if you have a character that is like a priest, for example, and he's shown very negatively and very greedy and selfish and something, and an actual priest was to say, oh, we're not all like that, well, then you have to prove it. So it's that thing of saying certain things about certain people, not necessarily to paint them all with the same brush, but to force people to not be like that. So you have, things like the monk in Robin Hood and the Monk, or the
greedy abbot.
The greedy abbot, and the other priests from the Cellarer from St. Mary's in The Jest of Robin Hood, which are poor examples of their vocation, but they are not representative of the vocation, in that Robin is very, very pious. He is very orthodox in his piety as well. He isn't radical in any sense, really. So when you have the sheriff, it's that same sort of thing where the sheriff is only a villain because he is a villain. Like the story requires there to be a villain, and it is the sheriff, but that doesn't mean that a sheriff in real life needs to be like that. And so by having these real, that's why I think the sheriff is a very important character, in that he is an actual role in society. So it's not like, we can sort of talk about Guy of Gisborne separately, because I think he's a different sort of, different beast altogether.
But it's not like it's just Lord de Bracy or...
No, it's a unnamed person. It is just the sheriff. He doesn't have a name because he represents the institution of the law and order in the town. And if you are the sheriff, not to be like that. And if you are, then you're just proving Robin's point. So you're required to engage with the story, even if you're not a part of it. Because instead of having, like, for example, the Tale of Gamlen, another 14th century outlaw story where you have these figures who are named, or figures who have a very specific, direct interpersonal relationship with the protagonist. So in Gamlen's case, it's his brother who cheats him of his inheritance and kicks him out, and you have him going off into the woods with another band of outlaws. It's very much in the way of, I'm telling a story about a person who's up against another person and they have an interpersonal conflict. But with Robin Hood, you have a group of people, like a cast of characters who are our protagonists, who are named, like Robin and John and Will and Much, but they go up against essentially faceless villains because they represent the possibility of those institutions doing bad things. And that extends to class as well. So you have the bishops and you have the sheriff, but also you have people like the Potter, where the Potter doesn't have a name in Robin Hood and the Potter. He is just representative of the mercantile class in the exact same way that the sheriff and the bishops are representative. So the point is, Robin is going up against social concepts, and you, by nature of being a person, by your personhood and being in the Middle Ages and hearing the story, if you hear the opening lines of Robin Hood and the Potter, where it says, "Harken's good yeomen, comely, courteous, and good," it's talking to you not by your name, but by your social identity. And you can either choose to be reflected well by agreeing with Robin Hood, or you can choose to be reflected poorly by going up against him. So he is forcing you to make an opinion. He's forcing you to have an opinion and forcing you to make some sort of value judgment and kind of coercing people into that position. But that's exactly what it's designed to do. It's designed to push people to have an opinion about something, and in a direction which pushes people to make a right decision, not a wrong decision. It's that element of shame and shaming and guilt, saying, if you are feeling bad about me talking about bishops, why? If you're a good bishop, great. But if you disagree, why do you disagree? So there's this constant questioning that's happening in the literary works, which then extends outwards by nature of the character in performances. And so when Robin is performed in public, those same questions then come up, where it's like, are you going to accept that Robin is here? If you are, good. If you're not, why not? So you may not agree with the character. You may just straight up, as a audience member, not like the story. But there is a social message there that you are forced to engage with as well.
Yeah, that is probably one of my favorite things about Robin Hood and the Monk in particular, because I don't like that story. It's, I don't know, weirdly cruel and not to my tastes, but it does provoke a lot of thought and discussion. It does provoke this idea of Robin Hood is trying to just engage in a pious act. He just wants to go to the Church of St. Mary's in Nottingham and pray to the Virgin Mary. Like, that's just the thing that he wants to do. And he just wants to be left alone while he's doing that. And somebody narcs on him. You know? And does the monk deserve to die for this? No, but it provokes that idea of, but he was doing the wrong thing. And how far should Little John go to rescue his friend and leader later,
Yeah.
And I think those are really interesting questions. There's a lot of death and bloodshed that occurs along the way, but who was in the wrong during any of that?
Yeah. That's something that came up during the Q&A in Leeds after my presentation. Someone saying, well, what about the violent aspects of the story, with people getting their heads lopped off? So I was in a panel with two people who were talking about execution. And so one was about the wars of independence in Scotland with Edward I really putting them down. And another one was about paper crowns and crowns of thorns being put on traitors' heads when they were killed. So there was a theme of violence and coerced violence running throughout. And the thing that came up in the Q&A relevant to Robin Hood and the Monk was, I think I said that in the Robin Hood poems, so specifically the medieval poems that survive, people only really die if they break an oath. Because the idea is to alter people's behavior. Like we were saying, there's this thing of you have to pick a side. You're forced to pick a side even if you don't want to. And the idea is to encourage good behavior. And killing someone is not going to help because they're just dead. But in Robin Hood and the Monk and the Jester of Robin Hood, when the sheriff dies, these are people who have broken oaths. So in the case of Robin Hood and the Monk, the idea, I guess, is that the monk, as a man of the church, and Robin in church, physically in St. Mary's itself, has certain protections there based on his being in a holy place. And because the monk went and told the sheriff, and the sheriff burst into the church and captured Robin, the monk has then broken his sacred oath of protection. Even though Robin is an outlaw, there are still rules. Like if Robin went into the church and claimed sanctuary, then legally he was allowed to stay there for 40 days until he worked something out, basically. Might be a bit different because he's already an outlaw by this point. But the idea is that the monk has broken his oath of spiritual protection. And then in the Jest of Robin Hood, the sheriff dies only once he's broken the oath that he makes to Robin to not hurt them. So when he is captured after Little John leads him by the hand, basically, into the forest, and they humiliate the sheriff by dressing him up in a servant's clothing, Robin says, "I will let you go if you promise to never hurt us." And then there's the archery contest, and the sheriff goes and fights Robin and his men and severely injures a lot of them. John gets shot. And it's as a result of that action that the sheriff is killed. So it's a bit iffy because the monk's page also gets killed in Robin Hood.
I was going to say, we get a lot of collateral damage in the monk too. We get a bunch of the sheriff's men get killed while they're to capture Robin as well, and then the page is the really notable one. I have some thoughts on that, but go on.
I guess it's just like when there's a melee, then I guess people get hurt. But when it comes to a semi-execution style death, it only happens when someone has broken a oath, which is the most sacred thing that you can break in the Middle Ages, an oath. That's why you do homage to your liege lord as a knight, is not because you are just acknowledging that someone is senior to you. It's you are making a binding religious oath. So it's not just saying, if you signed a document, then you can just burn the document and whatever. You made this promise, this sacred promise, because it means that much more. And so with that in mind, I guess we have Guy of Gisborne as well, who is like Robin, a yeoman, but who has betrayed his class, I guess, his birth and his breeding by hunting his fellow yeomen. So even though Robin is an outlaw, so he's sort of free game, the text mentions that his sword is bloody and rusted with the blood of the people that he has killed, and he says, "I've done many a cursed turn." It says the dagger he wore by his side has been many a man's bane. So he's clearly rejected his nature as a yeoman, but also just as a human being, basically.
Right, as a decent person,
Yeah, and so that's why he dies. Robin says to him, "Thou hast been traitor all thy life, which thing must have an end." So he's like the other villains who have broken oaths. He can't be humiliated to change his behavior because he's already too far gone. He has to be, doesn't have to be, but within the logic of the story, he has to be killed because there's no way of rehabilitating him or getting him to change his behavior.
So I think that's absolutely right on. And one of the things that I enjoy about the Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne is that it has that dual quality. It has that, like that action movie, somebody's having their big climactic battle with somebody who's kind of their equal number. And in movies, the majority of the time, the bad guy dies. There's a big climactic fight, and then the bad guy is killed, or they fall off a tower if it's a Disney movie or whatever. And I think of Robin Hood and the Monk also in that kind of popular culture sort of mass entertainment sort of way, where, and the primary comparison that comes to my mind is the John Wick movies. So
Yes.
you
Yeah.
have that inciting wrong. You have
Yeah.
somebody who does a thing that's unforgivable, just like you were saying. The monk betrays Robin Hood in this sacred place. That's the Robin Hood and the monk equivalent of the guy killing the dog at the first
Yeah.
Wick movie. And
Yeah.
then everything that happens afterwards, we're supposed to justify because
Yeah.
this transgression occurred and crosses a line, and then everything that happens afterwards is, fair game.
Yeah.
Robin Hood is just cool for killing all of the sheriff's men that try to arrest him in the same way that John Wick is cool for killing all of the gangsters' bodyguards.
I think your point about the sort of action movie aspect
Yeah.
of it is really important. So that's something that I think really you cannot detach from the medieval Robin, is how it was performed, how these texts aren't being read, they're being heard. And they're being heard in taverns, or they're being heard at May game celebrations, Whitsun celebrations, where there's a competition, there's sport, it's sporting. So when the monk dies, it's not, if you read it in isolation, if you're here in 2024 reading the text and it says the monk got his head cut off, you go, wow, that's violent. It's like, but it's not violent, it's playful, because you have to picture it as being out in the summer, people are drunk and they're swinging swords around, and there's a bit where someone's head gets cut off. It's fun. It's supposed to be that, exactly as you were saying, that sort of action movie thing of, hey, got him. It's not like that Austin Powers scene where it's like no one thinks of the family of a henchman. It's not like that. No one's thinking about the poor monk or the poor boy. Everyone's going, yeah,
Right.
cut that kid's head off, because it's a bit of fun. It's a bit of performance, vicarious. It's escapism. It's fantasy, like
Right. And
violent
this
movies.
is not to say that I am necessarily endorsing these as forms of entertainment, and
No,
that I don't think we
no.
should tell better forms of stories. Just acknowledging the reality that these
Yes.
stories exist and that they're popular and that people like them.
Yeah.
And I myself have basically done this same thing. I have been a performer in Renaissance fairs doing Robin Hood shows where we were doing combat.
Yeah.
We were doing kind of play games in that we had a plays that we were doing, and then there were fights in them in which,
Yeah.
I don't know that we had like people die exactly, but we had people getting stabbed, and the violence,
Mhm.
the pretend violence is certainly, it's the point, and it was
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's sort of my whole, basically the meat of my thesis is having that discussion about Robin as a performance. So if this is what happens in Robin Hood games, and if this is what the social message is, then to what extent are people comfortable with this character that is clearly popular dictating social mores, basically dictating social norms and conventions and allowing that to happen? So to what extent does Robin then present a threat to the established order, not through this whole anti-authoritarian thing, because Robin is not anti-authoritarian. He's very pro status quo, and it's just, again, if you break the status quo, then you're all the problem. But for the people that are establishing the status quo, to what extent are they pleased that these sorts of performances in which people are just cut down left, right, and center, based on a social value judgment, how comfortable are they with that occurring, and with Robin being the person who administers that form of restorative justice?
So along those lines, I'm trying to remember where I heard this, and I'm sure you just know, but there was some pushback from some priests, some members of the church that disliked the
Mm.
popularity of Robin Hood.
Yeah, so before the literary work of Robin Hood survives, there are references to people saying, I do not like Robin Hood. So Piers Plowman is probably the most famous one. In around 1377, the revision of Piers Plowman by William Langland, in which he includes a scene where a drunk priest can't remember
His paternoster.
his paternoster. Yeah, he can't remember the liturgy that he's supposed to perform, but he can, if you asked, do Robin Hood poems. There's another example from a didactic poem, an instructional poem called Dives and Pauper, which is around 1400 to 1410, where these two characters are just talking about the way that people engage with going to church and with religion. And someone says that Robin Hood takes people out of church. He says people would rather go hear a Robin Hood story than go to mass or matins or any lesson of the church.
That's the one I was thinking of, yeah.
Yeah, but this is a consistent thing. So in, I think it's 1540, Bishop Latimer, who was around in Henry VIII's time, was recalling an event that he apparently witnessed in the 1530s, only a few years earlier, where he went to go to a church to preach, but he found it locked. It was actually locked up. And he went to go find someone. And when he eventually found someone, he said, "Oh yeah, we're not doing church today because it's Robin Hood's day. So everyone's gone out to gather for Robin Hood." So they were out fundraising for the church, but under the name of Robin Hood and for Robin Hood. And Bishop Latimer's, this is in a sermon that he wrote. So he says people were out for gathering for Robin Hood instead of going to church. And then he says, "This is no laughing matter." So he's clearly writing his sermon expecting people to hear about this Robin Hood story and chuckle to themselves. But he's saying, no, this is serious. People are out mucking about in the name of a criminal rather than being in church where they should be. Mm-hmm. So Bishop Latimer was, I think, executed a few years later because he opposed Henry becoming the supreme head of the church. So he was a very orthodox person. But it's here that we get that duality again. Everyone agreed what Robin Hood meant in any given time. It's just whether or not you personally agreed with it or not. And so this is an example where in these sorts of contexts, from the 14th century all the way into the mid-16th century, Robin Hood is clearly popular with people, but not popular with religious authorities, even though Robin is very loyal to these religious authorities. It's just, if you are a bad person, the implication being, if you're a bad person, you don't like Robin. So it's sort of shooting themselves in the foot sort of moment where Bishop Latimer says, people going out with Robin Hood instead of going to church. It's like, yeah, but they're fundraising for the church. So, yeah. So we get these dual opinions that happen, but because Robin is so, as a character, is so cleverly constructed to make people align with his values or not, when we get criticism, it's almost exclusively by people who then, as a result, out themselves as being more on the negative social side than not. So,
and that's a trend that still goes on today with people who want to criticize various figures in popular culture because they feel it detracts from church, because they feel it is portraying bad values. And again and again, they're on the wrong side of history. And we've even seen this in the 20th century in relation to Robin Hood, in the case of McCarthyism and the Green Feather movement, where there are people who are trying to ban books, ban Robin Hood in particular, because of the communist ideals he was proposing, and people, students on campuses fighting for their right to protest, fighting against the banning of books. And, we are having similar conversations today about, the banning of books. And it's so much the same story again and again. And sometimes Robin Hood is there, but it's not necessarily him. It can be whoever. It can be Iron Man, it can be Spider-Man, it can be whoever is popular at any given time.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting when it comes to looking at Robin Hood in history, when it's being informed by things like films and like scholars who either lived through or are post-McCarthy era censorship, where they read in Robin Hood a sort of grassroots resistance to authority. But it's not quite there in the Middle Ages, but these same sort of things of censorship are. And so it's being read through the present a little bit too one for one, when, as you say, those aspects are still there. Those things of censorship are still there in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. It's just the extent to which they were associated with these resistance movements is questioned. So like McCarthyism, for example, is very famously just an absolute fest of people pointing at other people and saying, I don't like you. Like The Crucible, Arthur Miller's play, is a parody of the McCarthy quote unquote witch hunts. And so he made his play set in Salem during the witch trials just to sort of poke fun at how ridiculous the whole Red Scare thing was. And so people saying they will want to ban Robin Hood because he's communist. It's like, well, the message of Robin Hood is don't be a bad person, and you want to ban that. Is basically, if you strip it all back, that's kind of what the message is. It's just do not do things that will be negative to society. It's not just good guys versus bad guys. Good guys who have a social message of cohesion and community, and you want to ban that because you think it's communist. Like, that says much more about you than it does about Robin Hood.
There's a very long tradition of people wanting to ban books they haven't read also, though.
Yeah.
So, but there have been figures in the past, well before McCarthyism, where we did have examples of people who were trying to upset social orders, though, and they were identifying themselves as like Robin Hood's men, though, right?
Yeah, so that's what I wrote my first chapter on for my thesis, as it stands at the moment, as of 7:21 p.m. today. The first chapter is arguing that Robin Hood as a concept was always performative. It was always a set of characteristics that you then adopted in order to identify with those characteristics. And then over time, that turned into the literary character of Robin Hood. And so what I do in the first chapter, and will do in this second chapter, which is about performance, specifically structured performance, is the idea of people taking on the name of Robin Hood in order to achieve some sort of group aim. Not because Robin Hood means rebellion or Robin Hood means insurrection, but because Robin Hood means social cohesion and restorative justice. If I call myself Robin Hood, that signposts that, and therefore I can start making my claims with that already there. So it's sort of Robin Hood as the identifiable aspect of what you will be arguing, and then the specificity of that comes second. So it's the adoption of Robin Hood as a restorative persona comes first, and then the specificity second. So there are examples of people who take on the name in order to achieve very short-term goals. So, for example, there's a very famous example that's in Robin Hood scholarship a lot. In 1439, this guy, Piers Venables, which I was largely talking about in my Leeds paper, he and a group of men, specifically yeomen, freed a prisoner who was in transit, and then they fled into the woods. So the petition, the evidence we have for this is a petition that was put before Parliament saying, please help us catch these guys. Here is what happened. And it says that Piers Venables, with many misdoers being of his clothing, assembled in a raid, a group of men who then took John Foreman, who was the guy who was arrested, and having no livelihood nor sufficient goods, fled into the woods as like it had been Robin Hood and his men. So he didn't call himself Robin Hood, but their actions were enough to make the people writing the petition to think of Robin Hood. So the idea of this group of people who all dressed in presumably the same colored clothing probably, or having some sort of identifiable part of their clothing to aesthetically make themselves a cohesive group, and then go off and achieve a very short term, but achieve a group aim, was enough to make these people think, oh, that's like what happens with the Robin Hood stories. Around 1441, I think, there's an example where there were, it's hard to describe in medieval terms, but I guess what we would describe today is like an industrial strike, basically.
Yes, yes.
Where a group of people were threatening to cut off their local lord's head. And apparently they went through the town and chanted, "We are Robin Hood's men, war, war, right. War." So the difficulty with that source and the earlier source with Piers Venables and his men is that these are being written about by people who are reporting it for someone else. So the extent to which they gathered in such a way is questionable. But it's still important because it says this is how people who didn't like Robin Hood perceived Robin Hood. So even though they're being written from the perspective of we don't like that these people grouped together and made themselves a uniformed group. That then still tells us that, well, the flip side of that is that people think that Robin Hood is a character through which they can come together as a unified group. So even though they're not rebelling against the system or anything, they are still using the ideological baggage that comes with the name of Robin Hood to signpost their intentions and then going off and trying to achieve whatever their aim happens to be.
Now, those aims do seem to be of a, what we might consider a criminal bent.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I'm curious about and wanted to talk to you about is getting from that place where it seems like we're getting lower class people gathering together, whether they're calling themselves Robin Hood's men or other people are putting that label on them.
Yeah.
And then 100 years or so later, when we're getting Henry VIII play acting with his men as Robin Hood, and that, 100 years is a long period of time, but getting from that one place where it's like, here's a bunch of rowdy guys being Robin Hood's men versus these much more genteel noblemen being Robin Hood's men for play and fun.
So these performative aspects, so performative not in a dramatic, literary, theatrical sense, but literally performing as Robin Hood. These performative acts in the early or the first half of the 15th century, they're happening at the same time as the literary work is starting to come out. So it's not until the 1460s that Robin Hood and the Monk survives, but in 1440, so the mid 1440s, that's where we get the first paraphrased Robin Hood story. So in Walter Bower's Chronicle, he says, I don't like Robin Hood, I don't like people who like them, but here's a story that I do like. Because in that story, he holds a mass. And so as a priest himself, Walter Bower is approving of this. But that is a paraphrased version of a story. So there are stories in a literary sense starting to be circulated at the same time as these people are doing these performances. So they can't be so detached from each other that they would mean different things, which, I mean, you can argue the other way, that all things to all people thing, except that, again, if you look at a snapshot, so if you look at, which is hard to do before there are two source streams to work with, but if you look at the period in which Robin Hood literature is being written down and printed before the year 1500 and these more raucous and, as you say, criminal sort of implications, they are happening at the same time with the same intention. So the Robin Hood stories, the poems, are getting out a social message. And even though it is quite raucous and quite rough and in some estimations just sort of base criminality, basically, they're still trying to achieve an aim. So it's not just causing mischief for causing mischief's sake. There is a goal that they need to achieve. There's a B and they are at A and they go, how do we get from A to B? And Robin Hood for them is the answer. So whether or not that was effective is a different thing. All we really know is that there was that connection of, well, I need to get to this stage or I need to achieve this aim. I think Robin Hood as an idea will help me get there.
Now, and are you putting Henry VIII in that same category? This, I don't know, the objective of wooing Catherine of Aragorn in his situation?
Yeah, well, I think just to sort of backtrack a little as far as Robin Hood as a criminal goes, I think the fact that Robin Hood is in what we would now call the British outlaw genre, which includes people like Hereward the Wake against the Normans and Fulk Fitzwarren against King John, and Gamlin just as a medieval outlaw. I think what sets Robin aside is that he seems to have become an outlaw in the genre because the name was associated with actual criminals and actual crime. And so it's more a hangover from it as a nickname for criminals than it is we are going to narratively construct Robin as an outlaw. Because these other outlaws are outlaws because they have been unfairly treated by people. So they're not really outlaws. They're people who have been put in a position that they shouldn't be in. Outlaws are bad people. Being an outlaw is bad. But these people aren't bad because they shouldn't be there. Whereas is an outlaw because he is historically, in terms of the timeline, comes from a place where he was actually in criminal context with thieves and brawlers and, cattle rustlers, even in one example. So it's a hangover from when Robin was actually a criminal. And so when we get to Henry in 1510, when he dresses up with 11 of his men and storms Catherine of Aragon's chamber and disturbs her ladies and puts on a Robin Hood, probably a sort of mock fight with his men just to shock them. Even though it's in the context of being in the royal household, Henry is still playing the bandit. He is still playing the criminal. So I think with Henry, it's almost not like a taboo, but he's playing down. He's dressing up as a grubby, rough outlaw. And
slumming a little.
Yeah. And the fact that they break into the Queen's chamber with all her ladies in waiting, there's a sort of sexual game aspect to it as well. So it's kind of bawdy, it's kind of naughty, it's kind of raucous. So I think for Henry, Robin Hood isn't this, well, certainly not a hero. I don't think for Henry, Robin Hood is a character. Even though we're in a state where the jest has been around for a very long time at this stage, the play games are taking off, they're more popular than ever. But because of Henry's engagement with Robin Hood, we can see that there is still this idea of Robin as a criminal or as a bandit or as something a little less.
It's a very Don Juanish, coming, the roguish character coming into the lady's bedchamber.
Exactly, yeah. And we have to remember as well, this is I think 18-year-old Henry. This is a very young Henry VIII. He's only just become king. He's only been king for a few months. So this is a new king who is because Henry in his early life, obviously known for being very virile and very excitable and loved a game and loved to hunt. So this is that version of Henry. There's a really fantastic essay by John Marshall who talks about this, where he says that this version of Henry, the young Henry VIII, it enjoys this sort of taboo aspect and the companionship aspect as well. The fact that Henry is one of the 12 guys. He isn't there, and there are guys dressed as Robin Hood's men. He is one of them. He's one of Robin Hood's men. But then when we jump 5 years to 1515, Henry attends an event in which he is welcomed by Robin Hood and his men. So John Marshall writes that Henry is now at the state in his kingship where he then doesn't see himself as one of the companions. He doesn't see himself as one of the group of fellows. He sees himself as the king. And so he's like, well, I am now no longer part of this community. I don't need this support network around me. I'm the king. So that Robin Hood engagement later in 1515 is Henry in a position of, I am going to be entertained now by you, by Robin Hood.
Very much I'm not so much one of the boys anymore. Not so much that like group of frat brothers all playing their fun pranks. Yeah.
And I think that's an important aspect to emphasize as well when it comes to the performance of Robin, is that they tend to be in these sort of larger group contexts. So it's not just what Robin Hood stands for in a sort of narrative way. It's what he enables as well. And he enables community and he enables, I guess, friendship groups essentially. Like, even though Piers Venables and his guys apparently, if the petition is to be believed, did something very, very violent and very illegal, they were identifiable as a group. It's going back to that thing of affect. It's, I want to, they didn't just get a band of guys together and free the prisoner. They were like, we need to match. We need to have matching outfits. We need to look like we're a group of friends, basically. And when it comes to Henry, so you jump forward just shy of 100 years, and that same story is the thing that gets people on board with Robin Hood, is the idea of being a part of a community. And so when we see these early play games and early processions in the late 15th century, they're being sponsored by guilds. So it's guilds as organized groups, not just because they're largely sort of in the mercantile classes and they can afford to put on these sort of pageants. It's the thing of being identified as a group of people. I think the Drapers Guild is one of the earlier guilds that we can identify as sponsoring these plays. So they're coming from a perspective of a group more or less exclusive, not exclusive in the sort of modern, flash your membership card sort of sense, but a group of people that have a shared experience in the fellowship. And that's something that comes out of the medieval poetry, is the use of be a good fellow. It's not just in the sort of, like what we picture, the stereotypical like Monty Python British person being like good fellow. It's like literally a fellow. Yeah. It's a fellowship. It's a membership that you are being a part of.
And that's very key to something like Robin Hood and the Monk. That's so much about Little John rescuing Robin Hood. It's about them having that fellowship together. And that's one of the things that I really like about Guy of Gisborne poem. And I know that we don't know for sure whether or not that one is medieval, but
yeah.
And, and I mentioned like, oh, we've got this like climactic fight between these two forces, like in an action movie. But what sets Guy of Gisborne apart is how he is an individual. He is so much not a member of a fellowship. He is the literal, not literal, but the metaphorical lone wolf out there. He's working for the sheriff, but he's not in a fellowship with the sheriff. They're not friends. They're not, they only have this bounty hunter relationship. And Robin is a part of a fellowship. He is a part of a band. He is a part of something larger than himself. And then the climax of that story isn't even their duel and their battle, which is quite dramatic. It's how Robin Hood then goes off to save Little John. That crux, that saving of one another that you see again and again throughout those stories is so much an important element that ties into what you were just saying about Robin Hood representing or kind of giving a permission structure for these fellowships. And that's the opposite of what we see with our villains in these stories. They are solo actors.
Yeah, exactly. And then given that they are just titles, they're not names, that sort of emphasizes that this isn't individual, that there'll be another sheriff coming along. Like there's indicate that the sheriff of Nottingham between the stories is the same.
Yeah, and Guy has a name, but he's so independent.
Yeah, exactly. He has a name because he is unique. He has a name to emphasize the fact that he is standing out from the other villains in the story, and that he doesn't necessarily have a personal animosity to Robin, but in his existence, that is personal to Robin. Especially with, like you were saying earlier, there is that sort of duel aspect. So it's like, it's like a pun almost. Like there's a duel that happens, but there's duality in that poem as well.
Oh yes, very
Robin
much.
has the dream about being beaten by two yeomen. There's this theme of twos that runs throughout this poem, which in some ways is just convention. Like Robin greets Guy and Guy responds to him in mirror images, but there is very much this thing of twos going throughout, and then that deviation. But yeah, the going off and rescuing Little John is just emphasizing the fact that you need to then have this order restored. So like Robin Hood and the Monk can sort of be called, I think John Maddock had talked about this in his paper, saying it could be called Little John and the Monk, because Little John is the hero. The theme of the story is Little John doing right by someone who has wronged him because he needs to still uphold this community value, and Robin learns that lesson himself. Robin is the leader of these men, but he doesn't have anything about his clothing, or he doesn't have anything about him that is unique or special as a leader. He's presumably their elected leader, but he's still held to the same standard that they're all held to. And Robin obviously offers the leadership of the band to John, and John says, no, that's not how this works. So if John had accepted, then his whole effort would have been for nothing, because it's not about that. It's not about who should be in charge. It's about that there are people in charge, like the king, but the king is responsible as much as anyone for maintaining order. And so Robin, as the leader, needs to be held to the same standard as the rest of them. And Guy as a named villain, the only really named villain, apart from, Roger of Doncaster thrown in at the end of the
right,
is to highlight the fact that he is uniquely villainous.
So you just mentioned that idea of Robin Hood not having any thing that necessarily visually signifies him as
Mm.
a leader. And one of the things about our modern perception of Robin Hood is that he is instantly visually distinctive. Whether or not he's got the pointed bicocket or he's got a green cowl on between the hood or the hat and the bow and arrow and the green clothes. It's so much of a thing that that type of hat is called a Robin Hood hat. So much of a thing that the Mel Brooks parody movie is men in tights. You know, it's a
Yeah.
reference to apparel, even. In terms of visual iconography, you can always pick out Robin Hood. You know, he shows up in Shrek and he's speaking in a French accent and he's not really even behaving like Robin Hood, but you can still tell visually, boom, all those cues are there and you know it's Robin Hood.
Yeah.
Um, how would people recognize Robin Hood from a visual perspective before the modern era?
So there's sort of two ways of looking at this. The first being that you would know that it's Robin Hood by the person playing Robin Hood. So like in films, where as soon as, Errol Flynn pops up and it's handsome old Errol Flynn, you figure that's Robin Hood. You figure that's the hero.
That's the leading man.
Yeah, exactly. And so in these early fundraising processions in the sort of late 15th and early 16th centuries, Robin Hood tended to be played by someone who was very prominent. So the Robin Hood for the year would be a prominent member of like the local guild, or he'd be a prominent church warden or something. He'd be someone who has some sort of authoritative presence in the town, not necessarily because of their actual rank. Like, it wouldn't be the lord of the town playing Robin Hood, although I think that happened once or twice, but not by default. It would be someone who was respected enough in the town to be Robin Hood. So in that way, again, Robin Hood comes first and the specificity comes second. It's the idea of who can play Robin Hood. And so they find the best match. And so in that sense, you'd identify Robin Hood straight away because it's, oh, here is the most trustworthy, likable person in town coming forward. So all this group of men dressed identically, you'd be able to pick out who's Robin Hood because it's your favorite one, basically. The best guy or the nicest guy or whatever.
The guy everybody knows, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. But then the second aspect that we can take with it is that there would be no way to identify Robin Hood really, because again, it's that idea of Robin is just as responsible for being a part of the unit as anyone else. So he is the hero of the story or the main character, but he is part of a group. He is not an individual. He's part of a group. So we see in costume records, so a lot of, if not most of the records we have for Robin and Little John and Maid Marian and Friar Tuck, evidence that we have for these early performances in the very late 15th when it comes to surviving records, and then into the 16th century is actually costume accounts. So people making records of, I need a green coat for Robin and Little John, I need this for Marian, I need this for Friar Tuck, and they're all uniform. So there's even a record that says, I need a green cloth to make a hood and a scapulary for Friar Tuck. So even Friar Tuck is wearing green. Not we can assume not every time, because I think there's a very clear distinction between the Friar as a Morris Dance character and Friar Tuck, the Robin Hood character.
The Jolly Friar stock character.
Yes, yeah. So there's the Jolly Friar stock character and Friar Tuck, and they are similar, but I think very distinct. And not every Friar Tuck is a Jolly Friar, not every Jolly Friar is a Friar Tuck. So not all Friar Tucks presumably were wearing green, but Friar Tuck even did wear green. So the thing that's tying all these characters together is actually their uniformity and their being unidentifiable from each other rather than someone standing out. So we have costume records for particularly Robin and John are the figures. Robin Hood and Little John are the Robin Hood figures that appeared in these processions and these pageants and these games, where they're identical. It says, I need this for Robin Hood. And then when Little John appears, it's, I need this for Robin Hood and Little John. So they're wearing the same thing. They're wearing the same colored clothing, but they're wearing the same types of clothing. It says, I need a hat and a feather for the hat, a peacock feather for the hat for Robin Hood and Little John. So they're dressed identically. And then when Friar Tuck comes in, obviously he has the accoutrement of a priest. He's dressed as a friar, but they then make him, in some cases, wear green. So the important connective tissue between the aesthetics of these people and aligning them together is the color of their clothing not necessarily having any particular type of clothing.
By the time we're getting those, you said, what, 16th century records of costumes? And
So
Marion is being referenced.
very
Is
late
she
15th.
also in green by the time we're getting Marion referenced?
No, so I think there's one or two sort of outliers that talk about costumes for Marion that are in the same record, but it's ambiguous about whether that's supposed to be the same fabric for her or not. But then there are some that are very clear where it's like, I need a sarsenet gown for Maid Marian, which would be a special type of sort of silk, I think sarsenet is, where it wouldn't really be green, it'd be something else, where she's wearing clothing that is very distinctive for her to stand out as Maid Marian. And these early records are tricky as well because it's very unclear whether she is appearing, quote unquote, on the same bill as Robin or with Robin. And so in 1515 with Henry VIII meeting up with Robin Hood and his band of men as a proper kingly presence, that's a time when Marian is there as part of the group, but she's not necessarily dressed the same as the rest of them. In 1509, earlier, we have Henry and his group of guys. One of those guys was dressed up as Maid Marian, but he wasn't wearing green. He was
wearing
a dress. Yeah, so this is, again, John Marshall, who's done fantastic work the last 20 plus years, but particularly the last couple of years, writing about Robin Hood plays. He sort of says that this is something that's sort of missed, is that one of them was a Maid Marian figure in 1509, and presumably the joke is that they're dancing around this guy. And he gets this largely because we can tell who those 12 guys were, and one of them is like 21. He's a super young guy. 19 or 21 is really, really young, so he probably would have been the Maid Marian of the group. But then, yeah, he also points out in 1515 that there is, because again, through costume accounts, Richard Gibson, who was the master of the revels, his surviving accounts say, I need this for Little John, I need this for Robin Hood, I need this for Friar Tuck, I need this for Maid Marian. And it sort of gets missed that Marian and Tuck were there taking part in the Robin Hood game as Robin Hood characters. But again, this is taking place at a time where the Friar was a character and Maid Marian, coming from presumably the word May Marian as just the female dancing character in these games, was still around. So we've got this 4 different characters happening at once: the Friar, Friar Tuck, Maid Marian, and Maid Marian. So it's hard to disentangle who was who at times. But when it comes to these Robin Hood games of Henry VIII, we can definitely say this is a Maid Marian attached to Robin Hood. But with these churchwarden accounts that says, I got money received from this for this purpose, where we say a coat for Robin and John and this for Maid Marian, it's unclear there if that's for a Robin Hood version of Maid Marian or not. But given that they have different costumes, it's unlikely. But the flip side of that is that we see special costumes for Marian with the Henry VIII engagements. Yeah. And so very tricky to disentangle.
So Robin Hood wearing green and getting associated with this, the earliest account I'm familiar with in terms of referencing Robin Hood specifically with the color green and the idea that his men are wearing green is the Jest, right? Where the cook, where Little John is trying to bring the cook in, and he's saying, you'll get supplied with suits of Lincoln green.
Yeah.
And is that, to the best of our knowledge, where this association with Robin Hood and green is coming from?
Yes and no. So it is the first.
Always more complicated.
I know. So Robin Hood and the Monk, Robin Hood and the Potter, obviously older than the Jest, but there is nothing about clothing in that apart from Robin swapping clothes with the Potter. It is, yeah, as you say, the Jest where it says you will have 2 suits a year in this color. And then when the king arrives, he says, give me one of your green suits and I will dress up as you. So again, going to that thing of performance, it's like, hey, I'll dress up as you. I'll pretend I'm one of you. But there is possibly a genre aspect to this. So I know Helen Phillips has written a bit about this. There's a section of the Friar's Tale in the Canterbury Tales where the Friar's story is about an evil, wicked summoner. And the summoner being in the room with him, not wanting him to tell this story because he just knows it's going to be reflecting badly on him. But in the Friar's Tale, the summoner comes across a demon who is in disguise, and he's in disguise as a yeoman of the forest, and he's wearing green. And he implies that he's a bailiff as well. He implies that he's a bailiff just like the summoner is. And the summoner says, "Oh, how's your business been? How can I, do the same work as you do?" And then he sort of comes clean and says, "Oh, actually, my lord isn't very good to me. So what I do is I live in the woods and I make my living by however much people give me when I hold them up." So there is an aspect of Chaucer sort of nodding at the outlaw tradition there, but he also kind of gives a hint that yeomen wear green in literary works. So the disguised demon in the Friar's Tale is robbing from people, probably to be a little wink towards the outlaw tradition, but also to reflect on the summoner's job. So that's one thing. If we put that aside and just look at what he is aesthetically presenting as, he's presenting as a yeoman of the forest who wears green.
Right.
And so with Robin, he wears green for reasons of livery. So the word livery gets thrown around in that Robin wears his green clothing as livery to, I guess, associate himself with the forest, not as like camouflage, but because Robin again stands up for these, what he frames as natural conditions, like Gisborne, unnatural, so he needs to die. Robin is nature's man. He's wearing the livery of nature by wearing green. But there's probably also a generic component to it in that Robin is a yeoman. He's in the forest. Robin Hood and the Monk says the king makes, he's so pleased with Little John and Much for bringing the news of Robin's capture to him that he makes them his yeoman. So there's this idea of yeoman of the forest, yeoman wearing green before Robin explicitly wears green. But that could just be because sources don't survive they don't survive in abundance, really. So right. Chaucer could well be alluding to a tradition that Robin is a part of, but it's probably unlikely because I got the feeling that the reason why there are so few Robin Hood stories in text, in physical form, even throughout the 16th century, is because it wasn't a story that was read. It wasn't a story that was kept. It was a story that was, again, performed. It was a public thing. You didn't need to write this down unless you were going to read it yourself or give it to someone else to perform. So
yeah, like I said, I did these Ren Fair performances that were Robin Hood related, and I don't have scripts that I can show for those performances. There were lines we delivered, there were storylines that we portrayed, but unless somebody took a camcorder and recorded it, there's no record of the shows that we were doing, and that was just a few years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So the extent to which Robin wears green is maybe a literary trope that he then came across, was absorbed into him. But what is clear is that by the time of the jest, and by the time that it talks about Robin's men wearing Lincoln green, that was associated with Robin Hood. Green clothing is what Robin Hood did. So if before it was just a generic thing that yeomen wore green, by the time the jest was printed, certainly, green clothing meant Robin Hood. And so we get this, again, going back to Piers Venables and his band in 1439, where they were described as misdoers being of his clothing. So they're in matching clothing. So we can assume, we shouldn't assume, but they may have been in green. Because again, all of those guys, it lists there's a lot of people that they don't know were a part of this.
We can speculate that they might be, yes.
Yeah, so it names this person yeoman, this person yeoman. It gives their rank, but they're all the same rank. They're all yeomen, which could just be because they didn't know what they were, so they gave the most
something generic
round one. But there's enough there to sort of suggest that there is this, well, again, clearly a communal aspect that is attractive to them, but that clothing and matching clothing is absolutely a part of that. And so by the time we get to the Jest of Robin Hood being written or composed in the 15th century and then printed by at least 1495, green clothing was Robin Hood's clothing. That was what we did. And so we get these costume records which says, give me green clothing for Robin Hood. I need this green clothing for Robin Hood.
Yep. And, Kevin Costner and Taron Egerton aside, that's at least
Yes. Yeah, it's sort of stuck. But I guess it's because that meaning has gone, and some of it is natural, just because it's a 800-year-old story, and people just know that Robin Hood wears green. But it meant something back in the day. It meant either that or both. That thing of allegiance to nature and natural ideals. It was it was literally a uniform that if you wore the same thing, you were Robin Hood's man.
Yeah. Speaking of being speculative, the idea of there being that nature association, and we think of nature today as in plant lives and animals, flora, fauna, the outdoors. But in the Middle Ages, there was also so much a pervasive concept of nature as God's order.
Yes.
Things are natural because they are the way that God has ordered them to be. This is a time before evolutionary theory, before germ theory, before the notion that things can go extinct, and that things are the way they are because God has ordained them, and that is natural.
Yeah.
And we were talking earlier about that idea of Robin Hood in some ways defending the status quo. So I'm kind of wondering about this sort of notion of Robin Hood as this, you know, perhaps champion isn't quite the right word, but representative of the natural order and the natural world, and that is both representative of him living in the forest, but also of him supporting the people who are in positions of authority that do their job correctly.
Yeah. Well, it is highly visible. Like going to Sherwood yesterday, it was just crazy. Just going in the summer and seeing how green everything is. It's just green. That's all you can see. And so, just very simply, like you were saying, that is nature. Nature is green. That is what nature is. It is green. Decay is brown and grey, and we get Guy of Gisborne wearing a horse hide, which was probably brown or grey. Wouldn't be a bright green horse.
No, not unless he's coming from Oz.
Yeah, horse of different color. So Robin is in green in a very visible association with nature, and yeah, you can't really detach. This is something that I've been really a broken record of with my students this year, is saying you cannot detach religious life from people's understanding of the everyday in the Middle Ages, because religious life just was. You didn't even think about it. You didn't wake up and think, I'm in a world where religion is prominent. You just lived in a world and religion was prominent. So all of these things would be mashed in together. So the idea of the king being ordained by God was part of everyday life, even when they started renegotiating what that meant, when people were starting to question, well, maybe this person shouldn't be the king, but not because God got it wrong, but because something happened interpersonally, and so we can get a new king. So they were still rationalizing it as God's order. It's just we need to get the right person.
Yeah, in 1217, when the group of barons were trying to get Louis from France to be their king instead of John. And they were like, we need a king still. John's terrible. We hate him. We forced him to put his stamp on Magna Carta, but he's not going to go along with it. So we're going to get somebody else. But it was still very much we're going to have a king. And then John did everybody a favor by dying. And then they were like, okay, well, we can have his son. That's fine.
Yeah, that kind of proves the point of how important the right king was. The divine nature of the kingship winning out. So the city of London invited Louis over to be king, and they were really sponsoring his kingship. But then when John died, there was that question of, well, would he stay king, or would John's son Henry become king? And one of the things that William Marshall really got people on board with is, well, he's the rightful king. Why would you not go against it? And that worked. Like, there was a lot of resistance, obviously.
But they got him coordinated right away, they put those trappings on.
Yeah. But the PR worked because it was the correct king according to God's law. And with Edward II, that's sort of the point where he was removed by people who didn't like him, but they were very much the villains. Like Isabella, Franz, and Roger Mortimer were the villains of the piece. They have done something wrong. There was lots of people who were like, we don't like Edward, but we can't get rid of him. He's the king. What do you mean? We can try and get him to capitulate, but we can't get rid of him. And then he was removed, and people were saying, what have you done? Why? What do you mean you've murdered the king? And then Edward III coming in, claiming his majority like a month before he was 18, because again, he's the rightful king. It's only really when we get to Richard II and the cousin conflicts there, where it's like, that's when we start getting into genealogy and the obsession with royal genealogy, where it's trying to figure out, okay, who actually is the right one? And that's where blood comes in. It's because it's not blood based on weird things of familial loyalty. It's blood based on which one is God's chosen bloodline. And so trying to figure out the complications of that. But yeah, so the divine nature of things is very important. And that's why Robin is so loyal to the king, is not necessarily because the Robin Hood story in the Middle Ages doesn't necessarily engage with issues of systemic political issues. But like we were saying at the start, it inherently does, because it requires you to have a stance. And so the king is present, but he's not necessarily an active part in the story, not because he isn't important as a person, but because he's just assumed as a member of medieval society to be involved. And that's where we end up with situations where the king is tricked by Little John and Much in Robin Hood of the Monk. He's not a victim. He's just had the wool pulled over his eyes, and really nothing too bad has happened. And the worst thing that Robin does against the king in the Middle Ages, I guess, is that in the jest, he comes into his service, but then he leaves again. And he leaves by having to lie to him.
Yeah, leaves without permission,
Yeah, so that's the worst thing. But he hasn't disrespected the king. That's really the first time where Robin does something identifiably opposed to authority, because up until this point, this is across all the stories as well, Robin has been upholding the social order. It's really when he leaves the king in the jest that is the first thing that he actually does wrong from a legal perspective, in that he abandons his post to go to the Greenwood.
Yeah, he does things like tricks the sheriff in Robin Hood and the Potter, luring him out into the woods and all. And the sheriff gets slain in both Robin and Guy of Gisborne and the Jest of Robin Hood, but it's that inaction kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. And the king's never at fault either. Because again, it assumes that the king is divinely right. The sheriff gets things wrong and is punished. The king doesn't. And not because kings in reality get it right all the time, but because the king in the story, we're in a world where Robin puts things back to a baseline of normalcy. That's the goal. And in that baseline of normalcy, the king is a good king. So King Edward in the jest never is framed as someone who does something bad. He just keeps hearing these stories from the sheriff about Robin Hood, and then he meets Robin and goes, oh, actually, you're all right. So the king is very passive in that story. He's never in the position that the sheriff is in doing something bad. So, yeah, that's that baseline which is important. And the king is a part of it, but a very passive part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Will. Look forward to hearing more over the next 18 months about how the thesis develops.
Yes, it's on its way. So yeah, all of these things are things that are sort of spinning plates that are going at the moment, and me trying to write something that will convince someone else that Robin is far more politically charged than he's given credit for. Again, not in that sort of anti-authoritarian way, but in that thing of he clearly is signposting things which people could find troubling, because his performances are so public, because he's out in the streets. He's not just a story in the taverns that you can ignore. He's walking through the street, waving to people, getting money off people in the street. So he has to mean more than just a guy who does fun little japes in stories.
Yeah.
Because he's in reality more than he's in stories.
Yeah, that's true. We have so many more. He plays so much more around the periphery of lived lives than like written or sung stories and plays. Yeah.
Yeah, something I talked about at Leeds a bit is this idea, when you gave money to Robin Hood, you would, as a donation, when Robin was going around giving you money, giving the church money that he raised from donations, you would get a badge, like a paper badge, to sort of make you one of Robin Hood's men, and sort of what that means for so openly aligning with someone who isn't the king or the lord whose land you're on. If you give Robin money and mark yourself out as one of Robin's men, the people who aren't marked as Robin's men there's some records of people being harassed and attacked for not giving money to Robin Hood. So there is this allegiance issue there because, again, Robin was present. He wasn't hypothetical. He was there in front of you trying to get money from you.
Right, which is a very fun way of looking at how much Robin Hood was absolutely real while also 100% distancing yourself from what we traditionally think of as the quote and unquote real Robin Hood, as though he is a individual historical personage.
Yeah, there's that that quote from the BBC Robin Hood was like, "We are Robin Hood." That is very literal. Everyone could be Robin Hood, and that was the point. You could be Robin Hood. You should be Robin, because you need to pick a side, and you need to be like Robin Hood.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've been nattering on a bit, so that seems like a good place to end it.
Yes.
Glad that we could at least connect over Zoom while we're in the same time zone.
Yes. There isn't someone who's having to rush to bed or rush to work, so it's good.
Exactly.
Alrighty. Well, have a good night.
Yeah, you too. Take care there, Will. Thanks so much for the chat.
No worries, thanks.
My thanks again to Will for the fascinating conversation about the medieval outlaw who may have, in my interpretation, challenged the misuse of authority while still duly respecting the social order, but who also encouraged forms of social cohesion, provided a subject for pop culture entertainment, and potentially, right from the get-go, had a penchant for those suits of Lincoln green. You can hear my earlier discussion with Will about the tradition of medieval English outlaw tales from way back on episode 10, and he was one of the special guests for the Splitting Arrows episode covering the 1976 film Robin and Marian just recently with episode 42. You can also follow Will on Instagram with his account, True History of Robin Hood. On a personal note, I want to wish Will a hearty congratulations on having gotten married just a couple of days before this episode went up. Many happy returns to the both of you. Now, if you've got any thoughts you'd like to share about how either people of the past or of today interact with and interpret the figure of Robin Hood, then I'd love to hear from you. You can find Into the Greenwood on most of the major social media platforms, including the site formerly known as Twitter, as well as Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook, all with the handle @IntoGreenwood. You can also reach out directly via email with the address intogreenwood@gmail.com. There's also an active Discord server for all things Robin Hood related, run by friend of the show, Mike Nichols. If you'd like to join that Discord community where we source questions, organize watch parties, play games, have a book club, and just generally engage in friendly discussion, then reach out over email or social media to get an invitation. Into the Greenwood is supported by our amazing and generous followers on Patreon at patreon.com/intogreenwood. You can follow for absolutely free or contribute as little as $1 a month to help pay for our hosting fees. Patrons at the Merry Bandit and Notorious Outlaw levels also get bonus content that can include extended interview segments and other special audio exclusives, as well as some physical rewards such as a t-shirt. Will and I had a whole additional conversation about tourism in Nottingham and Sherwood that will go up on the Patreon soon. Now, these contributions are just barely covering our hosting fees at the moment, which means we're a far ways off from being able to purchase better equipment, which probably really shows in this episode. It was a tricky one to edit. But also research material, making compensations for the time required to put these episodes together, which sometimes takes quite a while. If you are willing to make perhaps just a small one-time contribution towards keeping Into the Greenwood on the air, we also have an account on buymeacoffee.com/intogreenwood. We've had a couple of tips left there by a generous listener, and after a solid year of unemployment, I can't begin to tell you how bolstering those were. And since this whole project is inspired by a forest hero who has become associated with charitable work, no matter how much or how little is contributed to keeping this podcast running, a minimum of 10% of all proceeds will be donated to a select charity. At this time, that charity remains our favorite, Trees, Water, and People, a top-rated charity dedicated to establishing sustainable access to food and clean water for impoverished communities around the world. If you are feeling a bit impoverished yourself, a positive rating or review, or just sharing a favorite episode or two, would do wonders for helping others to find the show. As a small, independent podcast amid thousands of options out there, it's a real challenge for our little show to break through and gain listeners. So every single rating or share makes a significant impact. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. Our theme music is by Plastic 3. That's all for now, though. So once again, I find myself wishing safe travels to you, one and all, until our next journey together into the Greenwood.